Welcome to episode 318 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired FBI forensic artist Lisa Bailey, who served in the FBI for 18 years. In this episode, she reviews the FBI's forensic facial approximation program, where she used human skulls and anthropologist reports to create sculptures of unidentified individuals to help investigators seeking the public's assistance in solving cold cases. Lisa also reviews the 5-year research project she launched on behalf of the FBI at the University of Tennessee's Body Farm, which resulted in the Bureau's 3D digital and photographic forensic art reference collection of over 100 contemporary skulls. Prior to the FBI, Lisa served in the U.S. Navy as a Russian linguist and worked as a graphic artist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. She began her FBI career in the investigative and prosecutive graphic unit at the FBI laboratory 2 months after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Lisa created presentations and demonstrative evidence for the prosecution of a major terror suspect. In addition to creating composite sketches of terror suspects, Lisa's casework included age progressions of wanted fugitives and post-mortem images of unidentified victims. She rose to become the FBI's first female forensic sculptor, creating realistic sculptures from the skulls of unidentified victims. Lisa was an adjunct faculty member at the FBI Academy and an instructor of the FBI's forensic facial imaging class. Her work has been featured on the FBI website and social media platforms, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Lisa is the author of Clay and Bones: My Life as an FBI Forensic Artist. Visit her website, lisabaileyauthor.com, to learn more about Lisa and her book. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Plus, there's my FBI word search puzzle book, Fun for Armchair Detectives. Thank you for your support, and I want to give a special shout out to Simon Rushforth from West Yorkshire in the UK, who says that he listens to the show while walking his Springer Spaniel, Chase, which coincidentally is my son's name. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired FBI forensic artist, Lisa Bailey. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am fantastic. Now, I have to give a shout out to Kathy Sturman, who introduced us. She told me all about your new book that was launched in February of 2024, Clay and Bones: My Life as an FBI Forensic Artist.
It was the strangest thing how Kathy and I ended up meeting. She made a comment on my Instagram. I wrote to her, and it turns out we both live an hour apart in Portugal. So that was a really funny coincidence.
It certainly sounds like it was meant to happen.
I really think it was, because I had read, when I was writing my book, or before I even wrote it, I was reading every FBI book I could get my hands on, and I certainly read hers. So to find out that she was an hour away, pretty much lost my mind. So she's terrific. Yeah, we talked all day, the day we met up.
Well, I should mention that Kathy has been on FBI Retired Case File Review. She was on episode 233 And it was all about her being a legat in the FBI's office in India and China, and about her book. It's not about the gun and women in the FBI. I would think that reading Kathy's book was very helpful in you writing your book.
Absolutely.
A lot of things were very similar, which we'll talk about at the very end. Before we get to the case review, once a month, I review a FBI TV show or FBI movie for teachable moments about FBI policy and procedures. And I had just finished reviewing the TV show Bones. That's when I did my own research and was learning a little bit more about the FBI's forensic anthropology program and making some comments about the TV show. So let me ask you about Bones. What do you think about that TV show?
Oh, I'm laughing. I wonder why I'm laughing. It's funny because the two anthropologists that I worked with, there's a lot of eye rolling with basically any forensic artist and forensic anthropologist about that show, just because we can't distance ourselves from it. I'm sure it's a great show, and I know a lot of people love it. They kind of lost me on, I think it was the very first episode. They did a holographic facial approximation, and I nearly fell off the couch. And I told my husband, I said, I can't, I can't watch it because I know how it's really done. I know it's a great show that it gets a lot of people interested in the FBI, interested in the work, but I've actually had some people ask me if holograms are possible with facial approximation, and no, they're not.
Well, that's the great thing about this case review that we're going to do today, because we all, including me, are going to get to know what it's really like to be a forensic artist with the FBI and to work with the FBI's forensic anthropologist, which you did on a regular basis.
Yes.
I just want to make sure everybody understands, and that I understand, that a forensic artist, whether in the FBI or outside the FBI, do a number of things, including composites, age progressions, which deal with the identification of the living. And then there's also forensic artists that do post-mortem images and facial approximations that deal with the identification of the dead. Now, that last one was what you spent most of your FBI career doing. Is that right?
Yes, the facial approximation absolutely fascinated me from the time I saw my first skull in real life and learned of the process. I just thought, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. I was fascinated by it.
Well, I read the book and I was fascinated by it too. So I thought what we might do is have you review a case where you were called in to work on unknown human remains and to put together a post-mortem image of what that person would look like if they were alive.
Yes.
All right. So where do you want to start?
First, maybe just give a little overview of what facial approximation is, if that's okay.
That would be very helpful.
Facial approximations from the skull, they're essentially the last resort, the last chance for a person to be identified, because when a skull gets to the FBI for facial approximation, law enforcement has already gone through every other means of identification and nothing has come up. If the remains were decomposed, maybe they could get fingerprints, but there is no match in a database, no match to missing persons records, DNA, odontology reports. They've done everything they can to identify this person, have not been able to. So inherently, the facial approximations are cold cases. A quote unquote young cold case might be a year, but I've had some that are been 30 years or even more.
And what does law enforcement do with these facial images?
Ideally, they will put them out to the public. Well, I'll backtrack. When I first started at the FBI, I started in 2001, and when I'd done my first facial approximation was probably 2005 or 6. I noticed that I would get one done and it would go to the investigator and then you didn't see it anywhere. It was like, it might have been in a local newspaper or something, but this person could have gone missing from New York and ended up in Idaho. It's a national problem with unidentified remains. There is now a national database, namus.gov, namus.gov. So now when we do facial approximations, they will go into that database. They have unidentified remains and any image that may have been done for that case. And they also have a missing person component, but that's a little bit outside of this. So now they will go into a national database, and that's open to the public. A lot of times, law enforcement, they will try to publicize the case because that's a big thing with forensic art is that we need the public to help solve our cases. The whole point is to get them out to the public where somebody can go, I think that person looks familiar. I recognize that person. That's true in a facial approximation. It's true in a composite sketch. In fugitive age progressions, we're looking for identification. We rely on the public for that. The images will go into that national database, and then family members, anybody who has maybe a missing loved one, are able to go into that and do a search and see if the unfortunate possibility is that maybe that they are deceased.
And how is that searchable? Is it searchable by where the body was located, or the age, or size, or gender of the person?
Pretty much everything. So the objective of NamUs is so that family members can go in and search for a missing loved one. And it's searchable by age and when the body was found, the location the body was found. The unfortunate problem with that is that some of these search parameters are things that the family does not know, or else they wouldn't be searching. The NamUs database was originally created by medical examiners to keep track of and locate their own cases that they worked on. And then it was retasked into a public database, which is great for unidentifieds because before then there was nowhere else for them to go or to be seen. But there still needs to be some work done on some of the search parameters. There are some problems there.
What would work better?
What would work better is instead of having text entry, well, I'll put it this way. Let's say the family knows that their brother broke their left leg, so they would search for broken left leg. Well, the medical examiner might have written healed fracture of the distal left tibia. The language doesn't match. So there needs to be fields that will prevent that. So if you just have a free text search, there's no cross definition in there. The family's not going to know to search with a healed left tibia or anything like that. They're not going to know that. So the problem is they could enter what they think is the most identifiable information, and it'll actually prevent that result from coming up because it's not a literal match. So in my mind, and I hope somebody from NamUs is listening, what the database needs to have is only information that the family would know. And it would be kind of like a thinking algorithm that would give more weight to certain things than it did to others. So there would be like a variable built in. If the family is searching for somebody that went missing 20 years ago and would have been, say, 40, then the database needs to be able to account for that, for the time that has elapsed since the person went missing. You need to go back to the time range when that person would have been born. Instead of the medical examiners or however this data is entered, that this is a 40-year-old body that was found in 1980, they need to backtrack and do the math and go, okay, this deceased body, this person was likely born between this date and this decade. Then it would have a better chance of matching up. So a family member is going to go in and say, okay, this is when I know my brother was born. I know we had brown hair, brown eyes. I know he went missing in 1980. Well, then it's not going to return 20-year-olds that were found in the year 2000 because the brother would have been 40 by then. See what I mean? The age of the remains is the main thing that is throwing that database off. That's the big problem I see with it because it is so variable. You don't know when somebody goes missing and 20 years have elapsed. Maybe they died the day after. Maybe they died 19 years and 11 months after. You don't know. That's the fuzzy gray area that has to be accounted for. And there are good minds out there that can fix it. I know it. There has been success with it, but I think it can work better. I'll say that I think it can work better.
Is there anything else that you want to tell us about post-mortem images before we start talking about one of the cases that you worked on?
I think the biggest thing is when people are looking at these images that we will never be able to get a perfect likeness because there's so much variability. We're basically trying to approximate what a person may have looked like based on their skull. There's just so many variables. There's some things that we can tell to a certain degree from the skull. There's others that we can't. And then there's situations where the condition of the skull will affect how we do the approximation. I'll give one example. I had a case once where we got the identification. It was a really great likeness. However, the person who had been identified had a very, very crooked nose. And this is something that the anthropologist would have definitely known. and would have pointed out for me to put in the approximation. However, when I got the skull, the nasal bones were completely broken off and gone. There was absolutely no clue as to what this man's nose looked like. The only logical choice I had was to create a straight nose. That's another one of those variables in the fuzzy areas, is that I would hate for somebody to say, well, that can't be my brother because he had a crooked nose. And it doesn't occur to them that maybe that part of the skull was missing and we didn't have that information to go on. The skull's sent in either by a police agency or a medical examiner. They come into the FBI and they first go to the anthropologist and any other units that might need to process any part of the body, like DNA, firearms, tool marks, things like that. After the anthropologist does their workup, they are the ones that do the age, sex, ancestry, and stature of the person, and they fill out a report and they give that to me, and that's when I get the skull. We discuss a little bit about what they're seeing in the skull, and then I have my eye on it in a bit of a different way. An anthropologist is looking for certain things. I'm kind of envisioning how the flesh will drape on the face. And when I see crooked eyes, I'm thinking of how to present that in a sculpture.
Reading your book, I thought that chapter 11 kind of pulled everything together. And I know I'm doing that backwards, having you tell us about a particular case before we've really gotten into taking a deep dive into what you do. But I really think illustrating what you do and talking about a case may make it easier for people to understand when we go into the detail. I'd like you to go over what is in your book as chapter 11. And the first thing I want to ask you is, why did you name it Against All Odds?
Because this was a particular case where when I finished it, I thought there's just no way this woman's going to be identified. There's too much going against it. It was really against all odds that she was, and not just her case, but another, which I can explain. It was one of the more unusual cases I worked on for background and everything.
In the chapter, you named this victim Greta Hudson. Is that her real name?
No, I changed names for all victims in the book. This is a real story. This is what was in the case report that I had to go on. It wasn't necessarily needed for the approximation, but it was background of how this case actually came to the FBI, which was pretty unusual. This young woman, Greta Hudson, her mother, Lily, had gone missing in 1970, and the daughter, Greta, was like only about 15 when she went missing. I guess there had been some family trouble. It wasn't the first time that the mother had gone missing, but this time was different. After a few days, they filed a missing persons report. I believe it was in Illinois. Nothing happened for a long time. It was about 26 years later that they heard anything, so now it's 1996. Police told them that a group of hunters had found skeletal remains in an abandoned brickyard. It was only 3 miles from where the family had lived. They couldn't do DNA at the time. This was 1996. So the police read the medical examiner's report, and they were just really sure that it was Lily Hudson, Greta's mom. So by all accounts, everything fit together. It certainly looked like this was Lily Hudson who had gone missing. The family just thought, well, this is closed. She's gone. The body was buried. They buried their mother. But the daughter, Greta, just wasn't quite sure that they buried the right person. She didn't even think her mom was dead. She would say she just had a feeling that she wasn't dead. So in 2009, Greta contacted the investigators and asked them to reopen the case because she had been reading about DNA and all the things that could be done with new technology. They actually exhumed the body. She had been buried 13 years before, and DNA samples were taken for comparison with Greta and the family members. And it turned out what Greta had suspected all along was that this was not her mother. Was it possible that her mother was still alive after all? And since now they knew that this wasn't Lily Hudson, then who was it? Now they had a missing person in addition to an unidentified remains case.
That's really fascinating because I am sure for most families, closure is important so that they can move on. And the fact that Greta was adamant that this is not her mother and that she was able to convince law enforcement to exhume the body and to do DNA is absolutely probably the most amazing part.
I really think it is, and kudos to the daughter for insisting because it takes quite a bit for an exhumation. It's not a quick process as far as all the permissions and everything, but Yeah, now they had 2 cases on their hands. The investigators, now that they had DNA, but there were no matches in any of the databases. All unidentified remains cases, they get case numbers at the law enforcement agency. And this particular one, just so I can reference, UF 526, that was the case number. With no matches in the database and they had nothing else to go on, police decided that they would try facial approximation. Facial approximations, they're really always a long shot. They really are pretty much the last attempt for somebody to be identified. But it had been more than a decade, and they were thinking, well, is there even going to be anybody that might know who this person is? They still decided to submit the case. They reburied the remains, put it as a Jane Doe. They sent the skull to the FBI laboratory. That's where I came in. Occasionally, the police will send the evidence to the FBI laboratory personally, but most of the time it's sent in via a commercial carrier like FedEx. There's nothing on the outside that lets the drivers know what's going on inside. We have had countless skulls come into the FBI laboratory. Entire bodies have been shipped in. One time I had an entire body that had been found in a swamp in my sculpting room. They come in through FedEx in unmarked boxes. Her skull came in like most of them. They're wrapped in bubble wrap, usually inside a styrofoam cooler. A copy of the original police report and a request for facial approximation will be along with that. The first place they always go is the anthropology department because they examine the skull and they create a general report for facial approximation. This is the most important step because I can't do anything with the skull until I know the approximate age, the sex, the stature, and the ancestry of the person. Forensic artists do not have that expertise. That is only something a trained anthropologist can do. The rate of the accuracy that the anthropologists come up with is based on the amount and the condition of the remains that are recovered. So the more that's recovered, the closer they can get. The best indication of gender is the pelvis. A female's pelvis is wider and it's broader than a man's. Obviously, it's adapted for childbearing. If the pelvis wasn't recovered, then the anthropologist has to rely on the skull and any other skeletal findings to determine the sex. Male skulls are generally larger and more rugged, and they have a more substantial brow ridge. And female skulls are smoother and smaller, and they have a softer brow ridge. So with the skull alone, the sex can be determined with about 90% accuracy. The stature is best determined by measuring the femur, or the thigh bone, which is the longest bone in the body. So the anthropologist might be able to tell whether a person was stocky and muscular, or smaller and more delicately framed. And bones continue to grow depending on the stress placed on them. A bodybuilder or a construction worker is going to have stronger bones and more developed muscle attachments than like a piano player would.
Is there still flesh attached to these bodies? And if so, how are they preserved?
Hopefully there's not much flesh, but I've certainly have had some where there is still some hair on the skull because things have mummified and there might still be a very thin layer of the scalp. And so there has been some hair still on the remains. That's very, disconcerting to come across. We really can't get anything as far as hairstyle or anything like that. It's kind of odd. It humanizes them because you see a skull and you go, oh, that's a skull, but then you see hair on the skull and it's hard to describe. It sort of makes it more real, if that's the right word. There have been skulls that have not been autopsied. Maybe they were found entirely skeletal. The cranium has not been opened and there will still be dried brain matter inside. And you can hear it rolling around in there. I don't mean to laugh. I'm a person who would never thought they would have gone into this field, and I am easily grossed out, but somehow I was able to work with skulls that had brain matter inside, and I guess I lived to tell the tale. It was just, you would collect anything that might have fallen, put it in a plastic bag, and yeah, there have been cases where there's still some tissue matter still attached to the skull.
Now I'm getting it because I'm thinking that you are getting ready to do your imaging, that you have some idea what this person looks like. But the fact that these are unsolved cases that you usually get maybe a year after the person's body has been recovered, and who knows how long it's been laying around where they found it. Am I correct that usually all you have are bones?
Exactly. The vast majority of the facial approximations we get were found as skeletal remains. Because if a body is found and there's still flesh attached, if it's decomposed, No medical examiner is going to take off the head and clean it for a facial approximation. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, there's primarily skeletal remains. It's messy business and it's expensive. And there's still a segment of the forensic community, maybe a large segment, that doesn't believe in facial approximation. So
You can't say that without giving us a little bit more
like,
information. There's people who don't believe in facial
absolutely.
approximation.
Facial approximation is actually a bit controversial in the scientific community because there have been a number of studies that have come out and said, well, it doesn't work. And the way these studies were done is that they would get, let's say, 10 pictures of facial approximations and then 10 photos of people. And they would give it to a group during the test and they would say, try to match up this facial approximation with the person. See if you can match to who it belongs to. People would only get it right about half the time. So the researchers said, well, this doesn't work any better than chance. The problem is the conclusion should not be that facial approximation doesn't work. The thing is that the study itself is flawed because facial approximation, we're relying on a friend or a family member, generally a family member, to recognize that person because there's just going to be subtleties. The family member is the person that knows that person. It is extremely rare to have a total stranger be able to make a match between an unidentified and a missing person. It happens, but it's rare. Facial approximation absolutely can work. It's not the number one go-to method, but when all the other options are gone, it is something absolutely valuable and worth trying because my case record and other case records alone show that it's absolutely possible. The first quote-unquote hit I ever got, she was identified because a family member saw that facial approximation.
Well, this will be a good time just to tease the fact that we're going to talk about a study that you did where you actually went to the
Yes.
body farm and had the opportunity to take skulls of people who had voluntarily given their bodies to science. So you knew what they looked like and to work on those skulls without seeing what the person looked like, and then being able to see how well you did. So almost giving yourself and the other forensic artists that worked with you on this study an opportunity to research and perfect your skills.
Yes. The body farm, that was a treasure trove of information. We learned so much.
And we'll talk about that more after we finish the case review. I just thought it would be a good opportunity to show how much you were concerned about the accuracy of what you're doing and what you were able to do to help perfect your skills as a forensic artist. Let's get back to this skull of this unknown person who was exhumed from a grave, and now you have the skull. First of all, I take it that the law enforcement agency who was sending these bodies and skulls has prearranged to send this, and the FBI has agreed to accept their particular case. You're not just getting skulls and bodies being sent without you even
Right.
knowing
They don't
they're
just
coming.
end up on our doorstep. Yeah. How that normally happens is an agency will contact the anthropologist directly, like say if they know about the program, and they will arrange for the skull to be sent in. Sometimes a body will be sent in, like say the investigator might have arranged with the evidence unit to send a body in for tests, and then they will ask, well, has a facial approximation ever been done? The agency might go, oh, I didn't know that was an option. And so then that will be done in addition to what the agency requested. The FBI, the laboratory, anything that they can do to help with the identification, if they aren't asked, they will offer. Yes.
This particular skull arrives and the case
Yes.
is assigned to you.
When I get the anthropology report, what I'm looking for, again, is the age, sex, ancestry, and stature. So ancestry, the anthropologist can determine that by examining the skull and any other remains that are found. They look for indications of age by the sutures in your skull, because when you get older, those fuse together or ossify. I've actually seen skulls at the Smithsonian where it was like a 90-year-old person's skull is completely smooth because all the sutures have fused together. Or somebody younger, they would still be open. The skull of a 20-year-old is going to look very different than somebody that's 70 or 80. For this case, she was a Caucasian female. The report had that she was 4'11 to 5'4", heavy set, 55 to 85 years old. Because that is a very wide range, 55 to 85, and you think, how am I going to present this person? That has a lot to do with the state of the remains when they were found. She had been out in the elements for years. Scavengers can pick apart a body within hours, and what they may not consume at the time can be carried off by rodents or over the years just washed away by the elements. So there was some damage to her skull, but all of the facial bones were still there. Sometimes when portions are missing, we can still do an approximation because we will take the other side of the skull and basically flip it to represent the missing part. That's not perfect because we're not symmetrical, but it's reasonable and it's the best predictor that we can use for that. But this skull was entirely intact. We always work on the resin replicas, like I said. So I take the skull out to work on, but I have it on the table to the left of me usually, and I put paper down. Like when I mentioned brain matter falling out, anything like that, it all ends up on the paper, and then that all gets packed away. Anything that falls off of the skull, to me, it's evidence and it's kept. It might look like dirt to me, but it might be something important. So first I read the anthropology report. What, of course, the anthropologist is saying, okay, well, there's some asymmetry here. I'm looking at it, I'm turning it in all different directions, going, okay, this left cheek is more recessed. In a lot of the cases I've seen and some things I learned from that research is that the cheek shape is different. If one cheek is more recessed, the fat pad that sits on that cheekbone is going to be shaped differently. The skull is the framework for the flesh and the fat that is on top. So then after I read the report and I look at the skull, I take the resin replica, and that's what I use to sculpt on. So I mount that onto a wooden stand. I keep the skull to the left of me. And the first thing we do after reading the report is we apply tissue depth markers. I know a lot of people have seen pictures of this where they've got the little rubber erasers stuck all over the head. Those tissue depths are the millimeter average of the skin, the fat, the muscles in your face. That's used as a guideline. They're not absolutes. They're guidelines for how much thickness to put on each portion of the skull. Your forehead, that might only be about 5 millimeters thick. I mean, if you can feel your own forehead and you feel how close you are to the bone there, that's just only a few millimeters. Along the jawline, it can be 15, 20. So again, those are just all averages. The anthropologist and I, we work together when deciding how much flesh, how much to build up the skull. That is based on the information that the skull's giving us. We might put more flesh or clay on one part than another rather than just following those tissue depth markers exactly. Just to bring up this point, that's why it's so important to work with an anthropologist. To me, that's one of the perfect things in the FBI process is it's an artist and an anthropologist working together.
I do want to just remind people that if they want to get an understanding of what you're talking about, that's the cover of your book.
Oh, that's right. Yes, it is. May I say what an amazing skull that is? I saw that photo and it was like, I've got to have that picture because that was actually used as a teaching skull. It's got tissue depth markers on it, and if anybody, they look closely, they can see that somebody made pencil markings on the skull, which they shouldn't have done. But if it was a teaching copy, then I guess that's okay if it wasn't casework. But yes, that's a perfect example. It's on the cover of my book.
And I will have an image of the cover of your book and, of course, a link to where they can purchase it. But you've also sent me some other photos of you in the lab working on sculpting. You have the skull next to you. So I want to make sure people know that in the show notes for this episode, they'll be able to look at all those images.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, so next, I attached the tissue depth markers. I've worked on so many skulls, I know them all by heart, the average tissue depths. I've got those memorized, but I still have a big poster. I created a poster that I put next to my work area to double check myself. Everybody thinks that my sculpting room or that inside the FBI is going to be all lights and cool glass showcases, and my sculpting room was just a laboratory room. Gray tables, white walls, very plain, nothing fancy. The tools that I use are just regular sculpting tools, and then some that I might have fixed together, like I might take a toothbrush and whittle one part of it down. A lot of sculptors do that. They make up their own tools.
And your office is at the FBI lab at Quantico, Virginia?
Yes. Originally, the FBI laboratory was at headquarters. That's when we were in a basement with no windows. But very nicely, the laboratory at Quantico is beautiful.
Yeah, I've had a chance to go there and get a tour twice.
When I first started the bureau and I'm working at the laboratory part of headquarters, I was geeked out. It was like, oh my God, this is where they're doing hairs and fibers. I got a mini tour when I first started, and yeah, I was overwhelmed and fascinated. So the skull comes in two pieces because there's your cranium and then the mandible. I need to reattach the mandible to the cranium. As long as there's two occluding teeth, two teeth that fit together, then you can get a good fit, is how the mandible fits to the cranium. Sometimes we get edentulous skulls, no teeth at all. And then, I don't want to say educated guesswork, but taking into account like the bone loss and everything to be able to fit the mandible to how it might have been in life and how long those teeth were missing. Thankfully, this skull, she had all of her teeth, or at least enough to work with. We attach the mandible. In life, there's synovial fluid connecting your mandible to your skull. I take a little bit of cotton and some hot glue, and I put that as a spacer and glue that together. Again, it's a plastic replica, so it's perfectly safe to do. You would not do that on an actual skull. So yes, when the anthropologists, they scan the skull, number one for record keeping, but also so that a replica can be made of the skull. That data starts as a point cloud, and then there's another group in the FBI laboratory. They put that together to be a 3D model that can be printed. The model unit prints that resin skull. That's what I use to sculpt on. I have the actual evidentiary skull next to me so I can refer to it, but I only sculpt on the plastic replica. Years ago, and I hate to say, in some cases, some artists are still sculpting on the real skull, and that should absolutely never be done, because it's evidence and then you're covering up your point of reference. We're always only sculpting on the replica. When we originally were doing facial approximations at the FBI, they were done in the 2D method, where you have a photograph of the skull and you're basically drawing over it. And it was only when we got a scanner that we were able to do sculptures, because we didn't have to impact the evidence. I believe the 3D printers were gotten for the model making in one purpose, but then somebody went, hey, we can use this to print skulls and do our facial approximations as sculptures instead. Both methods, 2D is, I'll say, just as viable as 3D. I always preferred the 3D. I just feel the face comes together better for me. In a drawing, you can lose so much if you shade it just a tad incorrectly or whatever, the entire face can look off. But when you're building it with clay on the skull replica, I feel much more confident in the result as a sculpture than I do in a drawing. So once I have everything together, I've got the mandible in place and I've got it on my sculpting stand, then I usually start by placing the eyes. It takes a lot of trial and error because they have to be set correctly in 3 dimensions. I fill the orbits with clay and I leave about a ½ inch of space from the forward edge so I have room to make adjustments. Now, I put on plastic gloves when I go to feel this on the real skull. Inside your orbit, there's a little bump. It's called the malar tubercle. This is where your outer eye ligament attaches. I need to make sure that the prosthetic eye that I'm going to insert has to be about 3 millimeters away to allow for the thickness of the tissue. In setting the eyes, there's 2 types of eyes you can use. Some artists like to use glass prosthetic eyes, and the ones that we used, they were completely neutral. I can talk about this more later, but we don't introduce color information into the facial approximation. They're kept entirely neutral. My first step is placing the eyeball. The average human eyeball is 25 millimeters, so that's what I use. I have seen, though, doing a lot of approximations that it seems like the bigger the eye orbits are, the larger the eyes are. Even by a millimeter, that's going to make a difference in how they look. Smaller orbits tend to have smaller, more deep-set eyes. Because of this woman's stature, even though it seemed like the eye orbits were a bit small, I didn't want to change the average. I just stuck to the 25 millimeters. It seems like a minor change, but I didn't want to deviate. I'll just stick with the standard. It's one of these things that I always fight with myself. Should I make this little change? Should I not? With this, I stayed with the 25 millimeters. To set the eye depth, I turn the skull to the side and I measure about 16 millimeters from the deepest part, looking at the side of your orbit, forward. The back part of your cornea should just touch that imaginary line, that 16 millimeters. There's pockets of fat behind our eyeballs. People, when they age and get the sunken in eyes, that's why. To set the eye depth, I turn the skull to the side and I measure 16 millimeters from the deepest edge of the orbit forward. This is where the back edge of the cornea should just touch. There are pockets of fat behind our eyeballs, and that amount decreases as we get older. Somebody in their 80s or 90s is going to have more sunken eyes because the fat padding has atrophied over time. I start with the bottom lid, and I put a little thin strip of clay, and I start on the outer edge of the eye, curving it inside towards the lacrimal bone. It's a little fingernail-sized bone on the inside of the eye socket. And then I do the upper lid the same way. I start on the inside and I aim it towards the outside. I add a little bit of clay around the lids to keep them from moving. I don't develop any part in detail at first. I'm getting things in place. I get the eyelids where they should be, add the clay on the outside, but I don't develop that further at this point. I put a layer of clay around the eye orbit. You might have seen some facial approximations where you see all the muscles have been developed. They've been sculpted in. I can go into that later, but I don't sculpt every muscle.
And why not?
Well, I took a class on this once. There are several methods. Some people like to sculpt all the muscles and then add the flesh on top, or just develop it from the tissue depths. The way I do it is I know where the muscles are, I know the form and function. I don't feel the need to sculpt them because when I took a class on this, we sculpted all the muscles, but then we weren't taking into account all the deeper muscles of the face, and then the fat and the nerves and the tendons. If you look at dissection of an actual human face and you see the muscles, and then you look at an artist's rendition of muscles sculpted onto a skull, it doesn't look alike. There's no way to know all the thicknesses of the muscles. There's no way for a layperson and even a doctor. I mean, there's a variation. So that's what the tissue depths are for. It would take hours and hours to sculpt all the muscles underneath, and it's not an accurate depiction of what a skull with the muscles attached would look like anyway.
And then you're going to put the tissues and the
Yes.
skin on top of that anyway, so you're not going to see it.
When I took that class, we sculpted all the muscles, and then we rolled out this big sheet of clay like a pizza crust, and we draped it over on top. And then if any of the tissue depth markers poked through, we added more clay. And so then I thought, well, why do we go to the trouble of sculpting all the muscles when you're going to build it up to the tissue depths anyway? I know plenty of artists that don't sculpt the muscles. I don't think it's necessary, and it's extremely time consuming, and that's something that would normally take 40 hours would be 120, and it's not an efficient way to do it. And I haven't seen it make a difference in the outcome. But it's very important that I know the muscles of the face, I know where they are, I know what the form and the function is. So like I've gotten the eyelids, so I'll do a thin circle of clay around where I've put the lids, and that's mimicking the muscle that encircles the eye, but I don't do any more detail, I just keep it as a rough draft. And then I roll out more clay, I put that to the forehead. I just sort of work from the top of the skull down, all very general, nothing in detail. I'll put some clay to the sides where the temporal muscle would be and work my way down. I do a wedge of clay, the thickness of the tissue, muscles, all that along the edge of your jaw. It's an average of 18 millimeters. Heavier would be more, lighter would be less. Again, we just go with average. So I will put a wedge of clay there and just start building the face from the top and the sides forward, keeping it rough. At this point, I might have spent about 8 hours on it because I go very slowly. If you start adding clay too quickly, you kind of lose your place. As I'm adding clay, I always keep parts of the skull exposed so I can see the difference in the depth that I'm working with, because there's not a tissue depth for every single section of the skull. Like something like lips. People will go, well, how do you know what somebody's lips are going to look like? We really don't. There are guidelines that you make them the same height as a tooth enamel. I know that's not true for me. If you just look around at friends and family and look at the thickness of their lips, do they match the height of your teeth enamel? I haven't seen a correlation personally. So if I were sculpting an older male, I would do thinner lips. If I were sculpting a young female, I would do a little bit thicker. But I haven't seen a strong correlation between that.
Do you consider ethnicity
yes.
also when you're sculpting?
Absolutely. Sometimes we'll get an admixture. The anthropologist might say Caucasian, possibly Hispanic, possibly African American. It's never 100% one way or the other. Sometimes it will be yes, this is most reasonably a Caucasian European derived skull. But a lot of times there's a crossover. That's why we try to diminish the things we don't know and highlight the things we do. With the nose is if the skull is intact, if none of the nasal bones are broken off, then we can get a pretty good depiction of the nose. One thing people are always interested in, how do we figure out how big or long the nose is? If you were to feel underneath your nose, there's a little hard part between the nostrils. It's called your anterior nasal spine. That's what supports the flesh and cartilage of your nose. So if that points forward, you're going to have a straight nose because it's supporting the flesh and the cartilage. It makes anatomical sense. If that nasal spine points down, you're going to have a downward tipped nose, and if it goes up, it will be more upwards. A lot of times that little nasal spine can be damaged, or it's going to be one of the first things rodents go for since it's very small. It's a small pointy feature. but it's the best indication we have for how to make the nose direction go. And then we have guidelines as far as the width, how wide to make the nostrils. That is just a little bit of math. Measure the nasal aperture, and the aperture is 2/3 of the overall width of the nose. I always have to sit and do some math there to make sure I get it right.
It really sounds that what you're doing is kind of a blend between art and science. You keep referring to these guidelines and doing a little bit of math. Would you agree that it's a combination of science and research along with your artistic skills?
It's been called a blend of art and science, and that is exactly what it is. What's very important is to keep up with the guidelines for facial approximation because there's new research all the time. And then to try to develop your artistic skills as much as possible so you can create a realistic looking face. For the first approximation I got a hit on, I was thrilled with getting an ID, and there was actually a resemblance. But to me, my skill level was just not there. So from that point, it was like, I'm going to take some more classes and learn how to create a more realistic face. I'll learn it if it kills me. But yes, it's art and the science. The art picks up where the science drops off. And it's just because there's only so much you're going to be able to tell about a person's face from their skull alone.
I take it in this particular skull of Jane Doe, you're also using that same blend when it comes to the lips.
Yes. She was determined to be between 55 and 85. For her, I believe I made the lips on a bit thinner side because 55, I mean, I'm a little bit older than that. I just have to look in the mirror. Yes, my lips are thinner than they were when I was 20 years old. I'd be sculpting something, and then I'd get in front of the mirror and I'd start feeling around my eyes and start feeling things like going, wait, I think that should maybe be thicker here. Every forensic artist does it. If they say they don't, they're lying. Every forensic artist, and they stare at people. I've tried not to stare at people because I'm just curious what their skull looks like. I want to know what's going on under there.
Well, that brings up something that I read about in the book, and that is sometimes when you're just talking with somebody, maybe having lunch or having a meeting, that you are looking at, oh, his eyes are not symmetrical, or that's interesting the way the lip pulls up on one side. So let's talk a little bit about that. We'll take a detour from
Yes.
Jane Doe for just a second to talk about your observations, because I would take it that's part of your training.
Absolutely. The more I learned about as I got IDs and I was able to compare the approximation I did with the photo that I got, learning more and more with each case, yeah, I would stare at people. I know my poor husband, I'd be talking to him and I might have been working on a particular case that was giving me trouble and he'd say, "Why you're looking at me funny?" And he's like, "You're looking at my skull, aren't you?" And I go, "Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure things out. I'm just trying to solve the puzzle." You get a bunch of forensic artists together. One time we were at a conference and we had an unusual looking waiter. He just had a very unique face. We were all staring at him and we started saying, we're going to make this poor guy paranoid because we keep staring at him. We were just dying to know what a skull looked like. I don't mean that to sound creepy, but forensic artists wonder. It's just all for our job. We're just trying to get better and understand. All the questions about what a person's face would look like based on a feature of their skull, those are kind of things that would literally keep me up at night. Should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? Eyelids, especially. Eyelids used to drive me crazy because it can really change the look of a person's face. But there's no way to exactly know how to shape the fold of your eyelid. It's called the epicanthal fold. Just one of the many things that I thought probably way too many hours about, but it was all for the job.
I would think that the brow area and the chin area are a little easier for you because of the fact that the bones are so prominent in those
Yes.
areas.
The forehead, yes, that's pretty consistent there. If you've got somebody with a very thick brow ridge, we would normally go over what the average tissue depths were for that because that indicates more muscle. Somebody with a very strong brow ridge would make it much more pronounced. For the upper part of the forehead, that's pretty consistent. But the brow ridge is where you see the biggest change in shape and direction. The stronger the brow ridge is on the skull, we're going to add more flesh for that area, for the brow ridge, because it just indicates thicker muscles. For the chin, I was actually able to get a scan of my own skull, which I'm pretty happy about. And I can say that if somebody reconstructed my face based on my skull, they would get my chin wrong. I know this sounds odd, but from looking at the scan of my skull, I know the tissue depth under there is, I think, 7 millimeters. My chin is longer than that. If my skull ever ends up somewhere that a forensic artist reconstructs my face, they'll get that part wrong because we can only go with averages.
As you're working on Jane Doe, we've now done her nose. We talked about her lips. You made them a little thinner. You've done her brow. You've worked on her chin. What about things like earlobes?
Ears, thankfully, are not very important for a facial approximation. We know where they go. It's called the external auditory meatus. It's the opening for your ear canal. We know where the ears go. We really have no indication of the size, how small or large ears, whether they project or not. We have no indication for that. It's not really much of an identifier anyway. Thankfully, that's one of the things that isn't as important.
I guess it's only a good identifier for somebody whose ears are abnormal. They're beyond average.
Yes, and that would be something like, say, in a composite drawing. That's where that would be a great identifier. If somebody says they're a witness to a crime and they say the bank robber had huge ears that stuck out, then that would be absolutely something that could be an identifier. But from the skull, I don't know that there's anything that would indicate that at all. We have nothing to compare it to, so.
And then I guess that's very similar to hair. How would you know somebody's hair, color, length, thickness from a skull?
We generally don't. Sometimes, even with skeletal remains, there might have been a little bit of hair, and there might be something in the Emmy report that says 6-inch long brown hair. Well, that might have been from just a few strands. I've seen some sculptures where they might have a brown wig put on them. We don't do that because, number one, hair color can change all the time. And then if we were to introduce hair color, well, then you need eye color, but we don't know the color of the eyes because they're skeletal. And then we don't know skin color. To me, it looks odd to have hair color on a sculpture that is otherwise completely neutral. So we don't introduce color information because we don't have it. And that's not the information we want the public to look at anyway. We want them to focus on the face shape, the features, the proportion, how everything is fitting together. And then, is there a possibility that this is my missing brother or sister? The hair color, the coloring could be the one thing that throws them off. It might make for a quote unquote nicer looking sculpture, but forensically, it's not necessary and it can detract. When you see a sculpture of George Washington or Lincoln or something, you know who it is because even though there's not color, you recognize that person. You don't need color for that.
You don't know how illustrative that comment is, because you're absolutely correct. When we see a bust in a museum of a famous figure, there is no color, but we know exactly who that person is without all of those details.
Right. And if it were possible to have all that color information, we would certainly use it, but we don't. My hair color has changed, I can't tell you how many times. So why introduce information that may not be right and could throw somebody off track? My first idea I talked about earlier, the woman had blue eyes. If I had done brown eyes, would she have been identified? Maybe, maybe not. It's just better to leave it out and educate people as to how these approximations should be viewed, what to pay attention to. Things like, oh, their eyebrows weren't like that. Well, we can't predict eyebrows. That to me is just part of educating people about what facial approximation is and how much it can show.
We're just about done with Jane Doe's sculpture here. So when it is complete, then what do you do?
When I get it about 80-90% done, the anthropologist looks at it and we go over it. I don't bring it to a high finish until they approve it. Once that's done, then we have photographs taken. The photographs in the anthropology report goes to the requester. So it could be a medical examiner's office or a law enforcement agency. It varies with each state or each agency where that's done. So we send the photos off. Hopefully those images will be uploaded into a database. They will hopefully be publicized. It's wonderful when you see press conferences and news articles about it because it will get people's attention. It does no good if nobody sees it. So we want the image to get out there as much as possible in front of as many people as possible.
So in this particular case that we're talking about with the Jane Doe, do you have any idea if anybody was able to identify her through the work that you did?
When I first started facial approximation, my biggest fear was that none of them would be identified. What if I went years without having an identification or my whole career? That was my biggest fear. I would never want to cause more harm than good. I really didn't have, honestly, a lot of hope for this case because so much time had gone by. But what happened was kind of like out of a movie. So my images are released. A woman named Faye was watching TV when she saw photos of the facial approximation we had done at the FBI. Kind of on a hunch, she called police and she told them about her mother who had disappeared in the 1980s. And some of the information with this facial approximation matched up. Her mom preferred being outdoors. She was about 5'2", which is in the range of the Jane Doe. She was a bit overweight, and she would have been about 50 years old when she went missing, which is in line with the 55 to 85 that we had. She remembered that when they had found the body in the brickyard, her mother had been ruled out and had been identified as somebody else. But now that the case reopened, she thought, well, maybe that's my mother after all. So she submitted a DNA sample, and it was a perfect match. So the facial approximation that I did was that woman's mother, Helen Carol Aiken. So that unidentified was solved. But then what about the woman whose mother had gone missing, Greta? While investigators were pursuing the unidentified case, there were also another set of investigators were pursuing the missing mother. Greta was in her backyard one day, and a detective called and said that they had found her mother alive. Originally, her mother goes missing in the 70s. Police say, we found a body, we think that's her, they bury her. She goes, no, I think my mother's still alive. They exhume the body. Turns out it's not her. Now she finds out, 20, 30 years later, that her mother is alive after all. I just gave myself goosebumps because it was just such a crazy outcome.
Absolutely. In this particular case, you have gotten your own closure. You know the work that you've done has helped to identify somebody. And because of the DNA check that was done at the beginning of this, they were able to find Greta's mother, and she was alive. Do you normally get that type of information? Of all the things that you've done, do you have any idea how many hits like this you actually have gotten?
I have a general idea of how many hits, but I never normally hear this kind of story. Most often, when we get an identification, we'll get the photo of the person, and that's all we really hear about it. That's it. But this actually made the news. It was crazy. Like when we found out at the Bureau what had happened, and then we're reading some news articles about it. Like I said, it was like something out of a movie. Who would have thought? So the two cases were essentially solved at the same time. I do remember reading the article about it, and they found her mother. She might have even been in a different country. And that's where once people are identified, even if still alive, then it's just up to the family. We may have tons of questions, and we're just never going to know the answers. We don't know why she left. We don't know if the daughter ever got back in touch with her mother. We don't know anything that happened. That's between the family. And that's just how so many of these cases pan out. We might get an identification and we'll get a photo, then that's it. And you're curious, frankly, at that point, it's none of our business. We've done our job, they've been identified, and then the family is left to deal with what's happened. It's a lot for the families to process.
But in those occasions where you're able to give answers to the loved one, that must feel good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a hard feeling to express because, on one hand, like when I found out about my first ID, I was ecstatic. I was just so thrilled. And then I immediately felt guilty, like, oh my God, this poor person has died. My husband pointed out rightly that I am not happy about the circumstances. I am pleased that the process worked. I'm pleased that I didn't hurt the case. I helped in some way. I was part of the team, part of the effort to identify this person. So for me, it was validation because, like I said, I was really worried that I'm going to go through my career and what if I don't ever get a hit? I probably wouldn't have had the job for 18 years if that had happened. But I mean, sooner or later, there's got to be results. There's a lot of luck and timing involved with forensic art, and years can go by before you hear anything. And then sometimes you might hear about 4 or 5 all in a row. It's just the nature of the work, and you can never predict. If I can tell you one thing that I just found out the other day, the very, very first facial approximation I did, it was 2D, and it was one that I really couldn't do any harm in because the person had been found in the woods in the 1980s. Literally, this detective had this skull in a box under his desk, and he was retiring, and he thought, I want to find out who this person is. I want to find out. It's my one last chance before I retire. And this case was nicknamed Mr. Bones in the press. And you can Google it and you can see it. I had done a drawing. It was my first facial approximation, 2D. It was kind of my training because I really could not do any harm at that point. I retired in 2019 and he had not been identified. Oh gosh, when it was released, it was probably 2006 or 7 and nothing happened. For whatever reason, I decided to Google that because I thought, well, there's no way he's been identified. He has been. He was identified 2 years ago. The very first one I ever did, he was identified through genetic genealogy. I was floored. I ran into the living room and told my husband, I said, oh my God, honey, remember Mr. Bones? He's been identified.
Congratulations.
My drawing had absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't care. He's been identified. And through genetic genealogy, they found the mom and a sister. I know there are a lot of internet sleuths trying to figure it out because the circumstances, he was found in the woods. He wore contact lenses, which was noted in the police report because it was unusual for the mid-'80s. He carried a book of poetry, which for some reason the police report noted that it was unusual for a man who looked to be hunting with a rifle and a flannel coat would be carrying a book of poetry. And there was a key where the number had been filed off, something that would almost be for a TV mystery or something. Yeah, you never know. So that's what, 40 some years after and he's been identified. It was amazing.
Well, that's great. Did you have an opportunity to look at your sculpture and then to look at actual pictures of him and make a comparison?
It was actually a drawing and it was horrible. I'm not being self deprecating, I'm really not. Some of the guidelines that we were following back then weren't the ones that I've done all my sculptures on. I was just nervous as anything doing the drawing. So the drawing was artistically tight. If you've heard that term in art, there's some artists have a very loose way of drawing. There was a bit of a resemblance. There were some things like I did see that the chin was pretty well on and the jawline. It's one of those things where I didn't care, it didn't matter, and I've learned so much more since then. Like if somebody re-gave me that skull, I would have done it completely differently because I've learned so much since then. 18 years or so since I originally did him. Artists will kick themselves, at least I do, about, oh, that's terrible quality. It's like, yeah, but he was ID'd. And I go, yeah, but I wanted the quality to be better.
I do want to mention that I have done an episode, matter of fact, a 2-part episode on genetic genealogy, episode 306 and 307. So if people want to know exactly what the process was for finding Mr. Bones, then they can check that out. But I do have a question for you because you mentioned something, and that is about the art quality. And I know in your book you talk about that there's a contradiction that's inherent about being a forensic artist.
We're called forensic artists, but we're not producing art. It's one of those things where you need to put any ego aside. It's visual information for forensic purposes. So you have to pull back from any kind of flair or expression. Like when doing the sculptures, I would just always have this back and forth in my head, like, well, maybe I could give it a little bit more detail. And it's like, no, you don't know that for sure. So pull back. There's a huge difference between a forensic approximation and a historic approximation. The historic ones, they can have color, they can have as much artistic leeway. So even though it's called forensic art, it's not really art. And I think actually the FBI had the best term for it. It was called forensic facial imaging, which sounds very dry, but it's the most accurate because we're not doing artwork. We have to suppress like any artistic expression or anything that could detract from the purpose of the case. That's why when we do facial approximations for unidentified remains, they're all in one color. We want the public to focus on the face shape and the structure and all those things with the purpose of identifying somebody. With historic approximations, even though those artists are following the forensic guidelines as far as tissue depths, and anthropologists and people at major universities have done these and they're beautiful, but it's fine for them to add hair color and eye color and clothing because there's no harm in it. That's completely open to expression. The reconstructions of Cleopatra and all that. There's no downside at all to adding color. It's what people expect. And in some of them, there might even be that information. If I'm thinking of the right one, Richard III, if there's paintings of Richard III and you have a skull, why wouldn't you put the color information in there? It just makes a more accurate representation of what he may have looked like.
And that definitely makes sense. We've been talking for a while,
Okay.
but there's a lot of things I still want to cover. I want to talk about the fact that you actually were an instructor at the FBI Academy. teaching your sculpting methods and your post-mortem imaging methods to members of law enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so twice a year, the FBI used to run the forensic facial imaging course, and it was open to state, local, and international law enforcement. It was a 3-week course that taught composites, age progressions, postmortems, and facial approximation. At one point, the class was restructured to focus more on the composite side, and the facial approximation was going to be put into a separate, more advanced course. But for a time there, when there was a little bit of overlap, we did have in the course like an introduction to facial approximation. It helped the students learn when doing their composites to be able to have a skull replica there. We had them sculpt the muscles on the face and explain to them how the forehead muscles, like when there's wrinkles in somebody's forehead, wrinkles are going horizontally. It's because the frontalis muscle, the muscle in your forehead, that pulls up. And so wrinkles form in opposite of the way the muscle stretches. Everybody says it's like an elastic waistband. You can stretch the elastic to the side, left and right, but the wrinkles go up and down. When you think about the anatomy of your face, when I get crow's feet, I can see that that's because of the eye muscle encircling my eye, things like that. It was a great course. There were several instructors. I was just one of several instructors. I have to say, I think it was just pretty much the best course out there. We did everything we could to prepare people for going out and doing the work. Later, when it was refocused on composite drawing, because frankly, that's what most forensic artists in state and local law enforcement are going to work on is composite sketches.
Can you explain to people that may not know what a composite sketch is and also talk a little bit about age progression?
A composite sketch is an image created from the parts of other images. To put it in simple terms, if anybody's seen a TV show where an artist is interviewing a witness to a crime, they're creating a composite sketch of that suspect. I always used to wonder, how is the artist possibly able to draw what another person has seen? It is possible because we use facial references. The witness is describing what they saw, what the features looked like, what the face shape was, but then we show them facial references. They look through a catalog. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So somebody can describe beady, close-set eyes and things like that. But if they can point to a picture and say, his eyes look like this, then we're on the same page. That was the focus of the course, started as and then was restructured back to being fully on composite drawings. Forensic art is a very odd niche field. There's not many of us. There's very few full-time forensic artists. Most forensic artists work on an as-needed basis within law enforcement agencies. Forensic art is not their full-time job. They're usually a detective or crime scene tech or a dispatcher. There's somebody that works in the agency, and then they do forensic art as it's needed. And what is most often needed are composite drawings. That's just the nature of the field. Those same artists might get the opportunity to do an age progression, so that was taught in the course as well. So fugitives, there have been cases where an artist might have done a composite drawing. The person has not been found, and 10 years later, that artist might actually do an age progression of their original composite drawing, and there has been success with that. At the Bureau, most often we did age progressions. It's always to refocus the public's attention on a case. The fugitive's been gone. Whitey Bulger is a perfect example. So many age progressions were done of him. And it's just to keep the case fresh in the public's mind, keep it out there. So you're essentially saying this person went missing when they were 30 years old. It's been 15 years. What would he look like at 45? And so we do our best with any information the agent might have. Like sometimes there'll be a tip. Like I had one case where they said, oh, this man who was in a biker gang or something, he now has a beard like ZZ Top. So I actually got to do an age progression, give somebody a beard that was like 2 feet long. Normally, they're not that different or unusual.
I did want to mention that I did a case review on the Whitey Bulger case, a 2-part episode, 282 and 283. And I actually have age progression work that I assume was done by somebody from your unit. So I will put that wanted flyer with the age progression photos in the show notes for your episode.
But I can't take credit for it. It was somebody else.
But people will at least be able to see what you're talking about. Oh, there's so many questions that we're not going to cover, but we have to cover the body farm. Tell everybody what the body farm is, and then tell us about the several years long study that you did having to do with skulls that you were provided from the body farm.
Is it wrong for me to say that the body farm was my happiest place on earth?
I can hear that. But before we start talking about your project, I think we need to explain what the body farm is.
So, the Body Farm is actually the University of Tennessee Anthropological Research Facility, started in the 80s by a professor there, Dr. William Bass. It's about a 2-acre plot of land outside the campus grounds. They lay out bodies in all situations. They might bury them, put them in the woods, put a cement block and submerge in water. All of this is to study decomposition and time since death. That was started in the 1980s by Dr. Bass. And now there's several body farms around the country, and I believe even internationally. That's just a necessary source for investigators to know how long a body might have been in a certain area. That is what they study. We learned so much. So how that project started is the forensic artist had almost no reference material for facial approximations. So there have been studies done, and we would share information as much as we could, but predicting what a feature would look like, in a perfect world, there would be pictures of skulls and pictures of faces, and you would be able to make better judgments in your work. But nothing like that existed because sensitivities to the family, like when somebody's been identified, you can't go to the family and say, we want to use your loved one's photograph. We can't do that. So this was a big problem. I was reading Dr. Bill Bass's book, Death's Acre, and I had read it like a year or so before, but I'm reading it. And then I thought, I think I'm going to donate my body to science. You can pre-donate your body. So I go to the Body Farm website. I'm going through the form, and I saw this thing where it was asking to submit a driver's license photo. And I looked at it and I went, oh my God, they have photos? I had no idea. There was actually somebody visiting for the University of Tennessee's anthropology department. And I asked them, I said, do you have photos of the donors? She looked at me and she said, yes. And I was like, how many? And she said, oh, maybe 50. And the FBI laboratory, being a laboratory, they have a research unit. And a light bulb went on over my head. It's like, well, if they have donor skulls and they know who they are and they have their medical history and they have photographs of them that permission has already been granted by the donor themselves, then I want to put together a research project and go down there and get all that information. I put in a proposal and said, I want to get as many skulls as I can, get the 3D scans, collect all the life photos, and it happened. I put in the project. About 9 months later, it was approved, and I couldn't believe it. In a bureau van one day with a couple of my coworkers, another forensic artist, a photographer, a model maker, and we're on our way to Knoxville, Tennessee. We went, I think, about 6 times, and we collected over 100 skulls. So we would go in. The first day, they had about 20 skulls set out for us. We scanned all the skulls with a digital scanner and attached tissue depths and took photos, both with and without. We collected all the life photos, and I would bring them back and just poured over them all, trying to figure things out. And the ultimate goal that I had was to create some sort of secure online database so I could share this information with other forensic artists. It was nothing that I wanted to be public. Number one, there would need to be permission with the University of Tennessee, but it was for research and casework and training. That was my ultimate goal. The project ended up being 5 years. Initially, projects go like a year, but as it turned out, well, there's no way to put this delicately, that at the time there were only 50 bodies, but then more bodies had been processed that had decomposed and their skeletons had been cleaned, so then more were available. I think we collected 122. The FBI has a contemporary database of 3D digital scans of skulls and the associated life photos. I learned so much information. I know I'm sounding, I don't know, a little bit giddy, but it was so exciting. It was so exciting.
What kind of things did you learn from having the photo and having the skull?
Ah, the cheek area, your cheekbone, this is zygomatic bone. I would look at a skull and say they had, like, their cheek area was very short and flat. And their life photo, they would have not sunken cheeks, but when they say good bone structure, this would be the opposite of that, like not great bone structure. When you talk about somebody, oh, they've got great cheekbones, great bone structure, that is true. That comes from the skull. So when I would have a skull where the zygomatic bone was maybe thin and concave, where it goes to the maxilla, concave from there, that would indicate sort of flatter cheeks and then like a double fold underneath their cheeks. I'll just say the parentheses lines around your mouth. It would be kind of like this fold of skin there when I saw that feature. And if somebody had very broad cheekbones, like higher and then flatter, that would be fleshy cheeks, like high cheekbones, good bone structure. It's better to show in pictures, and if I can, I would send some to show. But I mean, something like that gave so much information of how the skin would basically fall on the bone, how it would drape, if you want to put it that way. Anatomically, it makes sense because if you have nice, thick, fleshy cheeks, well, you need the bone structure underneath to support that fat pad. It makes sense that the skull is the basis for your face, and anatomically, you need that solid structure underneath to support that amount of flesh. And eyes, like I noticed so often that small eye orbits meant smaller deep set eyes and larger eye orbits. And this is nothing that I measured, it was just by looking. Just looking would be like, those orbits look big to me. And they would tend to have more expressive eyes. I had done a few facial approximations where I would make a choice to go, okay, this person has large orbits. I'm going to make these eyes a bit more prominent, a deeper eyelid. And it panned out. I would see identifications and it was like, wow, we learned so much. I was like a kid in a candy store. It was so much information to learn.
I can hear the excitement in your voice.
If there was to be any highlight of my career, it was that project. It was something I was never able to put online, but the information is still there. And I did learn that another university went and scanned the collection too, because it's Tennessee's information. We couldn't just like hand it over or anything. So other universities went and scanned it too and started using it for forensic art. I don't have this directly from the person, but one of my colleagues was talking to Dr. Bass, the one who actually started the facility there. He said that we never thought of the collection for forensic art. And that was a thrill. Actually, when we first proposed the project to Tennessee, they'd been using the collection for decomposition studies. The FBI has the classes that go out and diagram crime scenes and bodies. They actually told me that they had not considered forensic art to be a use for it, and it absolutely was. That was my big thrill.
I think I saw something on the FBI's website, along with a couple of interviews with you talking about forensic artists, but I've also seen a video about the body farm. So when it comes to the show notes, there are going to be so many links to supporting materials to help people get a better understanding of what you do. But one that's going to be the go-to place for them seeking more information is your website. Lisa Bailey, author. I was checking it out before we got on this call. There's a lot of information there, a lot of photos for everyone to look at, and a lot of the Q&A that we just don't have time to go over about what it's like to be a forensic artist and what it takes is in a section on your website that's called Forensic Art 101. I will make sure that there's a link to your website in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
In the book, you do address some very serious challenges that you had with managers. I found the book fascinating because of what I learned about you being a forensic artist. But I also found the book interesting because of how you handle these challenges. Was that one of your motivations for writing the book, to talk about those issues too?
Absolutely, yes. I never intended to write a book, which is funny. And if I had had a normal career at the FBI, I just would have retired and that would have been the end of it. The majority of my time at the FBI, I worked with great people. I loved my job. But unfortunately, I came against some pretty harsh discrimination and bullying and a hostile work environment. It happened after reorganization. Two supervisors somehow took a disliking to me, which happens. It was very blatant discrimination. I was the only senior female artist, and I was treated vastly different from the men. Not getting training tools that I needed for my job, having my BlackBerry taken away, things that were just beyond the pale for me. At one point, when my casework was jeopardized, I spoke up. I couldn't let that happen. It's part of the second half of the book. Some people that have read it, they've said, oh, it's triggering. I didn't want to read about discrimination. I didn't want to read about that. And it's like, well, I didn't want to live through it. I felt it was important to put in because it's the truth. It's what happened. I don't want it to happen to anybody else.
I'm glad you included it. It's part of your FBI story. There is no reason for us to minimize that. For me, it made what you were able to accomplish even more interesting because you did it in spite of these administrative challenges that affected the work that you did. Bravo to you for being brave enough to include it in the book.
That really does mean a lot to me. It really does. Thank you. I wish it had never happened, but if anybody asked me, should I join the FBI, I would still say yes. I had an amazing career.
The name of your book is Clay and Bones, My Life as a Forensic Artist. Thank you for writing the book.
That means a lot to me. It really does. There are so many good people at the FBI. I can't tell you how many fabulous people I worked with. Something funny, I was terrified to speak to an agent the first time I got there. I had to call an agent and I was petrified. May I say, FBI agents are some of the nicest people going. I had an overall great experience. I would not want what happened to me tarnish the whole FBI. It is not my overall impression of the FBI at all. It is something that happened, but I was proud to work at the FBI. I loved my job.
We're almost done, but I do want to make sure that I ask you my standard question: when and why you joined the FBI?
I never intended to join the FBI. I had no idea. I've heard this recently that you can only connect the dots from looking back, not forward. It was one of those luck and timing things where I had been in the Navy and then I had worked as a graphic artist at Johns Hopkins. One lucky day, I was reading the Washington Post and I saw a posting for an FBI illustrator. And I was thoroughly happy in my current job and I had no intention of leaving. But when I read everything in that job posting, this sounds like the best job in the world. I was just fascinated. So I put in my resume and I never expected to get it. This was pretty much pre-internet, so it was actually in the newspaper. The entire process took 3 years because I got stuck in a hiring freeze. So I put in my resume in 1998 and I didn't get to walk in the door until 2001. If nothing else, it's like I didn't give up, a little bit tenacious there. When the FBI told me I had the job, a few months later a hiring freeze went down, so I needed to wait that out. I had no idea I'd ever work at the FBI. I had no idea. I had no problem holding skulls or being around decomposing bodies at the body farm. I had no clue. But everything I did led up to it, was the perfect preparation for it. It got me to the FBI.
What are you doing now? I would hate to think that you are no longer using all of those skills that you gained during your 18 years working for the FBI.
I did leave earlier than expected. I was going to retire when I was 62 or 63, and I ended up leaving at 58. I lost 2 members of my family within 2 months, and I didn't want to be around death anymore. If none of those things had happened, I would probably have stayed, but I chose to leave early. It turned out to be a great thing. My husband and I now live in Portugal. Things couldn't be better. I am not doing forensic art. That's something only for law enforcement. What I try to do is help anybody else that wants to join the field. Anytime I can give a talk about it or help anybody that emails me or contacts me on my website, what can I do to be a forensic artist? I will tell them everything. I'm on to different things now. I am getting as far away from death as possible. I will occasionally watch a crime show here and there that involves facial approximation. I can't help it. There's still an interest, but other people are doing that now and I'm on to different things.
Are you still doing any type of art expression, sculpting or drawing on your own?
Was taking a fabulous life drawing course here in Portugal. And I've started doing the one thing I've never been able to before is drawing just for myself with no deadline, anything I want. And a lot of that is just cartoons, fun illustrations. It's anything that makes me laugh at the moment. That's what my drawing is now. I don't put it on my Instagram. I don't try to sell it. It's just fun sitting down with a piece of drawing paper and drawing. Maybe I'll end up sculpting one of the things that I draw. That would be kind of a fun thing to do. Make up something and then sculpt it. I'm not working with skulls anymore. I had lots of time to explore that, and it's time for something different.
I like to give my guest the last word. So, what would you like to say?
Thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak to you. I never imagined I would ever end up at the FBI as a forensic artist. It's truly the job that I felt like I was meant to do or destined to do. I wasn't planning on it. just the stars aligned. All the choices that I made when I was younger and the jobs I took and getting my degree all led to the FBI. I truly loved the job. I truly loved being a forensic artist there. It was some of the most unique and challenging work. In forensic art, there's so much variation in what we were able to do. If anybody's interested in becoming a forensic artist, they can look on my website. I do have some tips on there, some practical advice. I'm happy to help anybody that's interested in the field. I wouldn't have changed being a forensic artist for anything. It was a great career.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Lisa Bailey, case-related images, and links to articles about forensic artists, facial approximation, NamUs, my review of the TV show Bones for teachable moments about FBI policy and procedures, and a link to The Body Farm. And of course, there's a link to where you can buy Lisa's book, Clay and Bones, My Life as a Forensic Artist. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.